I could hear everything, but I could not move. My body was on the bed, and my mind was fully awake, and the tea Lena had brought me an hour earlier had done something to the space between those two things. I heard her voice in the hallway, low, directed at someone I could not see. She said, "Just make it look natural." Then footsteps. Then a man's voice at the door saying the dosage was too strong. Then Lena again, clearer now, saying that after Friday's hearing I would never be able to touch their money again. I lay in the dark of my childhood bedroom and I listened, and I did not move, and I understood, with the particular clarity of someone whose body has been taken but whose mind has not, exactly what was happening to me. Part 1. I need to tell you what brought me back to that house before I tell you what happened inside it. My mother Gloria called me on a Thursday in September. She said she needed knee surgery and that the recovery would require help at home for 2 weeks and that she didn't know who else to ask. She said it with the particular tone she used when she was presenting a request as a logical conclusion rather than an ask, which was how she framed most things that required something from me. I said I would come. I took 2 weeks of leave from my job in Virginia, packed what I needed, and drove 4 hours to the Pennsylvania house I had grown up in and had not stayed overnight in for 3 years. My name is April. I am 36 years old. I am a senior data analyst for a federal contractor in Virginia. My job I arrived at through a combination of genuine aptitude and the specific discipline of someone who learned early that nobody was going to advocate for her professional development except herself. I am precise and methodical, and I have a reputation at work for catching patterns in data that other people walk past without registering. I have been called detail-oriented so many times that I have stopped noting it as a compliment and started treating it as a description of how I am built. I had built my adult life at a careful distance from my family. Not a hostile distance, a functional one. The kind that allows you to attend the significant events and take the necessary calls and send the appropriate cards and still maintain the particular stability that proximity to certain family systems makes very difficult to sustain. I called on birthdays. I visited at Christmas. I came when my mother needed surgery. I did what I had always done. I showed up. I did the work. I did not require acknowledgement for doing it. And I drove home afterward and returned to the life I had made in Virginia that functioned on entirely different terms. Before I left for Pennsylvania, I had received a letter from the IRS. It was about $85,000 of unreported income from the previous tax year. Income I had not earned and had not reported because it had not existed. I had looked at the letter carefully and concluded it was a clerical error and had set it aside to address when I returned from helping my mother, which I now understand was the most expensive assumption I have ever made. My father, Richard, was at the house when I arrived. He and my mother had been married for 38 years, and their dynamic had the established quality of a system that had been running long enough to become invisible, not functioning well exactly, but functioning consistently and in ways that everyone inside it had stopped examining. My father was a man who controlled the shape of most things in that household without appearing to do so. The controlling was architectural rather than aggressive. He arranged conditions. He managed information. He created situations that produced outcomes he wanted while maintaining the presentation of a man who was simply present. I had known this about him since I was approximately 11 years old. My sister Lena was there too. She was 3 years younger than me and had lived within 20 minutes of our parents for her entire adult life, which was her choice and which I had never judged, though I had noticed the way her proximity had translated into a particular kind of influence over our father's perceptions and decisions. Lena presented herself as the devoted daughter. She was warm in public and strategic in private, and had the specific quality of someone who had learned to make loyalty look like love, and proximity look like sacrifice. She brought me herbal tea on the second evening. I should have registered this as unusual. Lena did not make gestures of care toward me as a habit. The tea arrived on a tray with a small honey jar, and she said she had made it for herself and thought I might want some after the long day. I was tired. I had been managing my mother's medications and her mobility and the household routines since I arrived, which was the pattern. I did the work. Lena performed the concern. I accepted the tea and drank it and went to my room. Within 40 minutes, I understood something had been added to it. My body stopped responding to my instructions in the particular sequence that a central nervous system depressant produces. First, the heaviness, then the disconnection, then the complete inability to move while the mind remained operational. I lay on the bed in my childhood room, and I was entirely awake and entirely unable to demonstrate that I was awake, and I heard footsteps in the hallway, and then Lena's voice, and then a man's voice, and then I heard enough to understand that the tea had not been an accident of generosity. It had been a plan. The man said the dosage was too strong. She said, "It doesn't matter, she'll be out until morning." She said Friday. She said hearing. She said after Friday I would never be able to touch their money again. I lay in the dark, and I did not move, and I memorized every word. Part 2. The paralysis began lifting around 3 in the morning, not all at once, in the specific incremental way that a sedative clears a system. First the fingers, then the hands, then the slow return of voluntary movement working upward through the body like circulation returning to a limb that had been compressed. I lay still for another 20 minutes after I could move, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to be certain before I acted. Certainty had always been the thing I waited for before moving. It had served me well in my professional life. It served me then. I dressed in the dark without turning on the light. I took my bag from under the bed where I had placed it when I unpacked, a habit from years of travel that meant my essentials were always organized and accessible. I took my phone, my wallet, my car keys, and my laptop. I did not take anything that was not mine. I moved through the house without turning on any lights, using the specific spatial memory of someone who had grown up in those rooms and knew every floorboard that would announce itself. I left through the back door at 3:47 in the morning. I drove to a gas station 4 miles from the house, and I sat in the parking lot under the fluorescent lights, and I breathed for a few minutes, and then I called the number I had found in Lena's coat pocket the previous afternoon. I had found it by accident. I had been looking for a pen and had reached into the coat hanging by the door and had found a folded piece of paper with a name and a number. The name was Marcus Webb. I had not recognized it and had replaced the paper and thought nothing further of it at the time. I was thinking a great deal about it now. Marcus answered on the 4th ring with the caution of someone receiving a call at 4 in the morning from an unknown number and trying to assess the situation before committing to a response. I told him my name. I told him where I had been and what had happened to me that evening. I told him I had heard his voice outside my door and that I had memorized what was said. There was a long pause. Then he told me everything. Marcus Webb was a private investigator. He had been retained by my father 6 weeks earlier to build a case supporting a guardianship petition. The petition, which had been filed without my knowledge at an address I had not provided, alleged that I was mentally incompetent, financially irresponsible, and incapable of managing my own affairs. It had been scheduled for a Friday hearing. My father had listed my parents' address as my legal residence to ensure I would not receive the court notice. The plan, as Marcus understood it, was for me to miss the hearing and for the petition to be granted by default. I asked him what he had found. He said, "Nothing." He said it with the specific weight of a man who had been hired to find something and had not found it, and was now sitting with the implications of that absence. He said I was financially stable, professionally credentialed, mentally competent by every available measure, and that there was nothing in my record or my behavior that supported a guardianship claim. He said he had told my father this 3 weeks ago. He said my father had not been pleased. Then Marcus said, "But I found other things." He paused. He said he had been doing this work for 16 years, and that when a client asked him to look for evidence of financial irresponsibility in a family member, and the family member turned out to be impeccably clean, he had learned to look in the other direction, toward the client. He said, "Your father has been using your identity for years, forged signatures, retirement accounts drained, loans in your name, tax fraud. The IRS letter you received was the most recent iteration of a scheme that goes back at least a decade." I sat in the gas station parking lot under the fluorescent lights. I said, "How long have you known this?" He said, "I confirmed the last piece 2 days ago." I said, "And the sedative tonight?" He was quiet. He said he had not known Lena was going to do that. He said she had acted outside what he had agreed to. He said he was not comfortable with what had happened and that it was part of why he had answered the phone. I said, "I need to know everything." He said, "I know. I'll tell you all of it." I had driven 4 hours to help my mother recover from knee surgery. I had arrived with a correctly filed tax return and a clean financial record and no knowledge of a Friday hearing designed to remove my legal autonomy. I was sitting in a gas station parking lot at 4 in the morning, having survived being deliberately sedated by my sister. The pattern had been running for 36 years. It had simply become impossible to look away from. Part 3. I drove back to Virginia that morning, not because I was running, because the work that needed doing required my own space, my own equipment, and the particular clarity of being somewhere that was not the house where someone had drugged me the night before. I stopped once for coffee and gas. I arrived at my apartment at 8:43. I showered and changed and sat at my desk, and I began making a list. The list was not emotional. It was operational. I had been trained, professionally and by temperament, to approach complex problems by identifying what I knew, what I needed, and what the correct sequence of next steps looked like. I applied that framework to the situation in front of me the same way I would apply it to a data anomaly that had surfaced in a federal contract audit. Methodically, without allowing what I felt about it to alter the accuracy of what I was seeing. What I was seeing was significant. Marcus sent me files that afternoon. He had been building documentation for weeks with the diligence of someone who had started looking in the right direction and had found more than he expected, and had continued because the professional obligation to follow evidence does not stop because the evidence becomes uncomfortable. The files were organized and thorough, forged signature samples alongside originals, financial account records showing withdrawals timed to periods when I had been traveling or otherwise unlikely to notice correspondence, loan applications in my name for properties I had never seen, tax filings that attributed income to me from sources connected to my father's failed investment ventures. 15 years of it. I sat with that number in the way I had sat with the count of items in my grandfather's folder, slowly, requiring more than one pass to accept as real. Then I remembered my grandmother's tin box. Eleanor Martinez had died when I was 21. She had pressed a small tin box into my hands at what turned out to be our last proper visit, 3 months before her death, and she had said with complete seriousness, "Do not open this in front of your father." She had said it once. She had not explained. I had taken the box back to my college apartment and had put it in the back of a drawer and had moved it through 4 apartments over 15 years without opening it because the instruction had been specific and I had not been certain, at any point in 15 years, that I was sufficiently outside my father's reach to be confident the instruction had been met. I opened it at my desk in Virginia on a Thursday afternoon. Inside was a handwritten letter and a document. The document was the original copy of Eleanor's will. I read it slowly. It was clear and legally formatted, and it designated a $400,000 estate inheritance to me directly, to be held in trust until I turned 25. The will had been filed with the probate court. I knew this because Eleanor's attorney's file stamp was on the first page. So I also knew that I had received nothing at 25. I had received nothing at any point. I had been told at the time of Eleanor's death that the estate had been modest and had covered her final expenses, and that there was nothing remaining for distribution. I read the letter. Eleanor had written it in the last weeks of her life with the specific urgency of someone who understands they are running out of time to say a necessary thing. She wrote that she had watched my father manage my invisibility for years, not with cruelty she could point to clearly, but with the consistent and patient work of a man who understood that a person who does not know what they are owed cannot advocate for it. She wrote that she had tried to address this directly with my father and had been managed in return, redirected and reassured until the window for direct action had closed. She wrote that she had done what she could from the position available to her. She wrote, "I am sorry I could not do more. The money was always meant to be yours. Do not let him take anything else." I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the box. I called Sandra Chen at 7 that evening. She had been recommended to me by a colleague whose judgment I trusted, a federal attorney with a specialization in financial fraud and family law, who had, according to my colleague, a particular talent for cases where the documentation was complex and the stakes were personal. She answered her office line directly, which told me something about her, and she listened to the complete summary I gave her without interrupting, which told me more. So when I finished, she said, "Do you have the original will document?" I said yes. She said, "And the forged signature samples?" I said yes. She said, "And the IRS correspondence and the loan applications?" I said, "All of it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The hearing is Friday." I said, "I know." She said, "I can be ready. Can you?" I had spent 36 years being the daughter who absorbed what was redirected away from her and kept going, the daughter who did not make things difficult, the daughter who arrived when called and left when convenient and built her life in a different state because the state she came from had never made sufficient room for her. I had spent 36 years being ready. I said, yes. Then I said, "I'll be there." Part 4. The courtroom was smaller than I had expected. A competency hearing is not a trial. There is no jury. There is a judge, attorneys, the petitioner, the respondent, and whatever documentation both sides have prepared. My father arrived with his attorney 9 minutes before the session was called. He saw me at the respondent's table with Sandra beside me, and he went through several expressions in rapid sequence before settling on the one he had probably rehearsed: concerned, paternal, the expression of a man who had filed the petition out of genuine worry for his daughter's welfare. I looked at him once, and then I looked at Sandra, and I did not look at him again. The hearing lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Sandra presented my employment record, my tax filings for the previous 7 years, my credit history, my bank statements, my professional certifications, and 2 letters from supervisors at my firm attesting to my competence and reliability. She presented the court notice that had been filed to my parents' address rather than my Virginia address, with documentation confirming my legal residence had been in Virginia for 4 consecutive years. She presented the forged signature samples alongside originals, with a handwriting analyst's written opinion comparing the two. The judge asked me 12 questions. I answered all 12 clearly, specifically, and without hesitation, because the questions were about my professional life and my financial situation and my daily functioning, and I had been building and managing all 3 without assistance for 15 years and could describe them with precision. My father's attorney made 3 arguments. Sandra addressed each one with the specific patience of someone who has encountered these arguments before and has prepared for them thoroughly. The third argument, that my presence at the hearing was itself evidence of instability, that a truly competent person would have engaged with the family's concerns rather than lawyering up, was the one the judge found most instructive, though not in the direction my father's attorney intended. The judge dismissed the petition. She said, "The documentation before this court does not support a finding of incompetence in any category." She said the filing address discrepancy was a matter she was referring to the court's oversight office. She said she was ordering a review of the petition's origins. She said all of this in the even, unhurried voice of a judge who has seen many things and has learned to deliver verdicts without editorializing, which made the words land with a weight that editorializing would have diminished. My father left the courtroom without speaking to me. I watched him go, and I felt the absence of the feeling I had expected to feel, which told me something about where I actually was. The weeks that followed were the most methodical of my life, which is a significant statement given my profession. Sandra coordinated with Marcus and with a forensic accountant she had worked with before, and with the federal investigators who became involved once the scope of the tax fraud became clear. I provided documentation. I answered questions. I organized files in the specific and efficient way of someone who has spent 15 years working in data and understands that the difference between a case that holds and a case that collapses is almost never the facts themselves, but the organization of the facts. The handwriting analysis confirmed 15 years of forged signatures across loan applications, account modification forms, and tax documents. Financial tracing connected the stolen funds to a sequence of my father's failed investment ventures across 3 states. Marcus had obtained security footage showing Lena accessing my bag during the 2 days I had been in the house, which corroborated what the pharmacological analysis of my blood sample, drawn by my own physician the morning I returned to Virginia, had already established. I had thought to request that blood draw before I drove home. That detail is worth noting because it was not strategic. It was the reflex of someone who had been trained to document anomalies before they faded. Applied to her own body on a Thursday morning at a clinic near the gas station where she had spent the night's darkest hours in a parking lot under fluorescent lights learning the shape of her own family. My father was arrested on a Tuesday afternoon. The charges were federal: identity theft, tax fraud, wire fraud, probate fraud for the Eleanor Martinez estate, and financial elder abuse relating to accounts held in my mother's name that I had not known about and which expanded the scope of what Richard had been doing to include people he had supposedly been protecting alongside the person he had been methodically exploiting. He was sentenced 8 months later to 12 years in federal prison with no early release consideration. The sentencing judge made a specific notation in the record about the calculated and sustained nature of the conduct and the particular harm of exploitation directed at a family member who had demonstrated consistent trust. Lena received probation. The court found that she had been operating under a significantly distorted understanding of events. My father had told her for years that I had been stealing from the family, which she had believed with the credulity of someone who had been managed by the same person for 39 years and had never had reason to question his account of anything. She had administered the sedative believing it was a mild sleep aid that would keep me calm until after a hearing she had been told was for my own protection. She had been wrong to do what she did. The court acknowledged both things simultaneously. I did not pursue additional civil action against Lena. Not as forgiveness, which was a different matter and one I was not ready to address. As a practical decision about where I wanted to direct my energy for the next several years of my life. My mother lost the family home. It was tied to loans my father had taken in her name, and the liquidation was part of the restitution process. She appeared at my apartment door on a Saturday morning in November with 2 suitcases and an expression that contained 38 years of choices she had made and was now living inside. She said she had nowhere else to go. I said, "I know that." She said, "I need your help." I looked at her. I said, "Mom, you knew about Eleanor's will. She had told me this in a letter she sent through Sandra's office after the arrest. A long and disorganized letter that was full of the specific guilt of someone who has been silent for a very long time and is now speaking too much at once. She had known. She had been afraid of what my father would do if she acted. She had chosen silence and had chosen it repeatedly for 15 years while I paid the cost. I said, "I am not the person who can fix what you're dealing with right now." She said, "You're my daughter." I said, "I know. And I'll always be your daughter, but I'm not going to absorb the consequences of your choices the way I absorbed everything else. That's not something I'm available for anymore." She stood at my door for a moment longer. Then she left. I closed the door and stood in the hallway of my apartment, and I let the silence settle into something I could breathe inside. The restitution recovered most of what had been taken. Not all. Some of the failed investments were genuinely gone, dissolved into markets that had moved on without them. But the bulk of Eleanor's $400,000 was recoverable through asset liquidation, and I received it through Sandra's careful management of the process 9 months after the sentencing. I held the figure in my mind for a while. The number my grandmother had set aside for me when I was young, that had been taken before I knew it existed. That had been sitting in the back of a drawer in a tin box through 4 apartments and 15 years waiting for me to be far enough away to open it. I used a portion to establish the Eleanor Martinez Foundation. The mission was specific. Financial abuse within families left particular kinds of damage because the exploitation came from the people trust had been built toward, and because the documentation of it was often entangled with the documentation of an entire life. The foundation provided legal assistance, forensic accounting support, and housing resources to women who had been financially exploited by family members and needed help building a coherent case or simply building a livable next chapter. I named it for a woman who had known what was happening and had done the most she could from the position available to her and had pressed a tin box into her granddaughter's hands with a single clear instruction. The cottage was in a quiet part of Virginia near a lake that was visible from the back window in the mornings when the mist was still on the water. I had bought it 6 months after the sentencing with a portion of the recovered funds and had moved in on a Saturday in March that was cold and clear and entirely ordinary, except for the fact that I was carrying the last box through a front door that belonged to me in a house I had chosen for no reason connected to anyone else's needs or expectations. I set the box down in the main room and I stood at the back window and I looked at the lake. I had been collecting material for a memoir since the Thursday morning I drove back to Virginia with a blood draw appointment and a tin box and a phone call to make. Not with the intention of producing a document organized around grievance, with the intention of producing something useful, an account of how a specific kind of exploitation operates over a long period inside a family structure, and how to recognize it and what the documentation process looks like and what comes after, for women who were still inside the thing I had just come through and needed to know that coming through was possible. I wrote most of the first draft at the kitchen table with the lake visible through the back window and the particular quiet of a house where nobody else's needs were making demands on the air. Marcus Webb came to the Foundation's first fundraising event. He stood near the back of the room with a glass of water and the expression of a man who had started a job in one direction and ended up somewhere considerably different and was still orienting to what that meant. I thanked him directly, and he said, "I should have moved sooner." I said, "You moved when you could." We both understood that was the most accurate thing either of us could say about it. Sandra was at the same event. She spoke briefly about the legal landscape around family financial abuse, precise and clear in the way she was precise and clear about everything. Afterward, she said the Foundation was filling a gap she had encountered repeatedly in her practice and that she intended to refer clients to it. I said I was glad. I drove home along the lake road in the late evening with the windows down and the Virginia air doing what Virginia air does in spring, warm and green and full of the particular promise of a season that has arrived after a winter that went on longer than expected. I thought about a gas station parking lot at 4 a.m. under fluorescent lights. I thought about a tin box in the back of a drawer through 4 apartments in 15 years. I thought about a woman who had pressed something into her granddaughter's hands and said only, "Not in front of your father." Eleanor had known what she was doing. She had known exactly what she was doing. I turned onto the lake road and the cottage lights were visible through the trees and I drove toward them and I thought, I am here. I built this. It is mine. That was enough. That was, without question, exactly enough.